The girl couldn't have been more than 7 years old, but the sign in her tiny hand stopped traffic. "Help my mom. She's dying." Painted in crooked red letters, the words screamed louder than the horns blaring in Times Square. Tourists passed, businessmen looked away, but one man, one of the wealthiest CEOs in America, froze in place. Daniel Hayes, a man who could buy a city block without blinking, felt his chest tighten when the child lifted a crumpled photo. The face staring back was a woman he once loved more than life itself. His ex-wife. Before we go further, think about this. What would you do if the daughter of your past love stood before you begging for her mother's life? Drop a comment if you believe fate can strike at the most unexpected moments, because what comes next will shock you even more. Daniel Hayes was used to chaos. He thrived in boardrooms where millions shifted with a single nod of his head. But nothing prepared him for the chaos of recognition, that gut punch when his eyes landed on the photograph. Emily Ross. The woman he hadn't seen in 7 years, the woman who walked out of his life without explanation, was now fighting to survive. And this little girl, this fragile vendor of oranges on the cold sidewalk, was begging strangers to save her mother. "Would you like to buy some fruit, sir?" the child asked, her voice polite but trembling. Her eyes were wide, impossibly blue, filled with a courage that didn't belong to someone her age. Daniel crouched, unsure if his voice would betray the storm inside him. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Grace," she said, clutching the sign tighter. "My mom is sick. The hospital said she needs an operation. I'm trying to help." Grace. The name cut into him like glass. She spoke with the innocence of a child, yet the weight of responsibility sat heavy on her shoulders. This was not a girl thinking about dolls or cartoons. She was bargaining with fate at a traffic light. Daniel's instincts, honed from years of negotiations, told him something didn't add up. Why was Emily here? Why was her daughter, Emily's daughter, standing on the street begging? More importantly, why did Grace's curls, the tilt of her chin, even the way she bit her lip? Echo memories Daniel thought he had buried. "I'll take them all," Daniel said, suddenly his voice sharper than he intended. Grace blinked in disbelief. All she whispered. Her small hands trembled as she began to count the oranges one by one, as though afraid he might change his mind. When he handed her the money, far more than the fruit was worth, she stared at the bills as if they were made of gold. "This will help Mom," she whispered. Then, with the wide-eyed trust only children can offer, she looked at him and asked, "Are you a good man?" The question nearly broke him. Daniel had been called many things: visionary, ruthless, brilliant. But never good, not since Emily left. And now, from the lips of a little girl who had no reason to doubt, the word echoed in his ears like a verdict: Minnie Hook. What Daniel didn't know was that Grace was not just any child. Every clue in her face, her voice, her mannerisms whispered a truth too terrifying to confront. Could she be his daughter? He forced a smile, crouching lower, so he met her eyes. "I'm trying to be," he said softly. Grace nodded, as if satisfied, then slipped the photo back into her coat pocket. Daniel's heart clenched. He needed another look. "Can I see the picture again?" he asked. She hesitated, then held it up. Emily, radiant as he remembered, smiled from the faded print. But her eyes, the same piercing blue as Grace's, seemed to accuse him across the years. Memories flooded back, late nights in their tiny apartment, promises made and broken the morning she left without a word. He thought he had buried that pain under skyscrapers of wealth. He was wrong. "Where's your mom now?" he asked, his voice unsteady. "At home. She can't get out of bed today. I told her I'd try to sell at least 10 oranges." Grace said it with matter-of-fact determination, as if caring for her mother was simply her role in life. Daniel glanced around. The city buzzed around them, indifferent to the drama playing out on the corner. His mind raced. If Emily was alive but gravely ill, if this child truly was hers, and possibly his, then every decision he had made in the last 7 years suddenly felt meaningless. He couldn't walk away, not this time. "Grace," he said carefully, "would it be all right if I walked with you when you go home?" She studied him with suspicion far older than her years. "Mom says not to talk to strangers." "You're right," Daniel replied. "That's very wise. But I promise I only want to make sure you're safe." Her lips pressed into a thoughtful line. Finally, she nodded. "Just to the corner." "Then you stop." And so began a walk that would change everything. Hook to pull the viewer deeper. What Daniel discovered at the end of that street would not only shake his empire, it would rip open the past he tried to bury. Stay with me, because the truth waiting behind that broken door will leave you breathless. If you were Daniel, would you follow that little girl to uncover the truth, or would you turn away? Comment below. I want to know what you would do, because Daniel's choice in that moment would decide the fate of 3 lives, and it was only the beginning. Daniel Hayes had built his empire on precision. Every decision, every acquisition, every gamble in the stock market was calculated with ruthless discipline. He was the man who turned late nights into billion-dollar mornings, the kind of leader financial magazines called the golden boy of Wall Street. Yet for all his power, there was one part of his life that never aligned, one ghost that lingered no matter how high his net worth climbed: Emily Ross. 7 years earlier, she had vanished from his life without a note, without an explanation that made sense. One morning, she was there, her laughter filling their modest apartment, her hand reaching for his in bed. By nightfall, she was gone. Daniel buried the wound under relentless ambition, telling himself that chasing success was easier than chasing answers. He built glass towers in San Francisco, moved deals across oceans, and watched his face appear on the covers of business journals. To the world, he was unstoppable. But behind the closed doors of his penthouse, silence had a way of reminding him of what he had lost. It wasn't that he hadn't tried to find her. In the beginning, he called. He sent messages. He even hired someone to track her down. But Emily had cut every tie, leaving only the bitter taste of betrayal. The unanswered questions gnawed at him. Had she fallen in love with someone else? Did she decide he wasn't enough? Or had his obsession with wealth simply broken something fragile between them? Whatever the truth, Daniel taught himself to stop asking. Instead, he focused on building an empire so vast no one would see the hollow center inside him. Now, standing on a noisy street with Emily's daughters staring back at him, those years of denial unraveled in seconds. Grace's face carried echoes he couldn't ignore. Her curls, her boldness, even the way she squared her shoulders, all reminders of Emily in her younger years. And yet, what frightened him most wasn't the resemblance. It was the timing. Grace looked about 6 or 7. The same number of years since Emily had disappeared. The arithmetic was merciless, and Daniel's chest tightened with the weight of realization. His mind flashed back to their last night together. Emily had been restless, pacing the small living room of their apartment in San Francisco. "You're chasing shadows," she had whispered, frustration tightening her voice. "All you think about is the next deal, the next win. What about us, Daniel? What about a life together?" He had brushed it off then, promising her that the sacrifices were temporary, that once his company reached the level he dreamed of, everything would be easier. But she hadn't believed him. He remembered the way she looked at him that night, tired, almost resigned. The next morning she was gone. Over the years, Daniel told himself she'd left because she didn't love him enough to stay. But, looking at Grace, he realized another possibility. What if Emily hadn't just left him? What if she had been protecting something? Protecting someone? That thought dug into him as deeply as any boardroom betrayal. For years, he had fought rivals, taken down companies and bent markets to his will. But nothing cut like the possibility that he had a daughter. He had never known a child who had grown up thinking he was nothing but a stranger. Minnie Hook. Imagine giving everything to build an empire only to discover the one thing that truly mattered had been lost in the process. That's the truth Daniel was choking on as he walked behind Grace that night. His phone buzzed in his pocket, the familiar vibration of yet another urgent message. The London acquisition. His board wanted answers, his investors demanded a signature. Billions were waiting for his attention. Yet, for the first time in years, Daniel didn't care. What use was a global empire if it meant turning his back on a child holding a cardboard sign in Times Square? What was the value of power if he couldn't even face the woman whose eyes haunted him from a photograph? His driver had once said that Daniel's greatest gift was knowing when to strike. But as he followed Grace's small steps toward a part of Queens where his name carried no weight, he realized this was not about strategy. This was about courage. Courage he wasn't sure he had anymore. He remembered how Emily used to tease him, calling him a man who could move mountains but couldn't cook an egg. She had been his grounding force, his compass. Without her, he had drifted into a world where stock numbers mattered more than human ones. And yet she had always known his weaknesses better than anyone. If she had truly kept Grace from him, it was not out of spite. It was out of a conviction that he would choose ambition over family every single time. Minnie Hook. But was she right? If Emily opened that door and confirmed the truth, would Daniel finally prove her wrong? Or would he crumble under the weight of the past? The ghosts of 7 years pressed in on him as he kept walking. He thought about the velvet box still hidden in his desk drawer in San Francisco. Inside sat the engagement ring he had bought for Emily, the promise he never gave her. Some nights he still opened the box and stared at it, wondering what his life might have been if he had chosen differently. Now, looking at Grace, he understood the cost of that hesitation. The cost wasn't measured in dollars or deals. It was measured in years of bedtime stories, untold birthdays, missed, and a little girl who had learned to beg strangers for help. Daniel Hayes, the man who had once prided himself on being untouchable, felt the cracks widening inside him. Every step closer to Emily's door was a step closer to the truth he had avoided for too long. And this time, no amount of money or power could shield him from it. Grace walked a few steps ahead of Daniel, her small sneakers slapping against the cracked sidewalk of Queens. She moved with a confidence that seemed too heavy for her age, as if she had walked this same path countless times with the weight of the world pressing on her shoulders. Daniel kept his distance, his eyes fixed on the back of her head, silently replaying the arithmetic that refused to leave his mind. 7 years gone. A child who looked just old enough to fit within that timeline. The truth pressed harder with every step. She glanced back at him once as if to make sure he hadn't disappeared, then slowed her pace, so they walked side by side. "You don't have to come this far," she said matter-of-factly. "I told you, just to the corner." Her voice was firm, cautious, but not unkind. Daniel gave her a small smile. "Sometimes it's safer to walk together," he replied. She shrugged, as though safety was a luxury she had stopped expecting. At the next red light, Grace dug into her pocket and pulled out a small notebook. She flipped it open and showed him a page filled with stick figures drawn in pencil. "That's me and Mom," she explained, pointing at 2 figures holding hands. Then her finger stopped on the 3rd figure drawn taller with broad shoulders. "That's my dad," she said quietly. "I don't know who he is, but I like to draw him anyway." The sketch was crude, the work of a child, but Daniel's throat tightened at the sight. Broad shoulders, dark hair, features that looked suspiciously like his own reflection. He forced himself to breathe, careful not to let the storm inside spill out. "Do you think he'll ever see your drawings?" he asked softly. Grace shook her head almost with resignation. "I don't think he even knows I exist." Those words cut deeper than any insult hurled in a boardroom. She wasn't bitter. She was simply stating a fact, and yet the innocence of it pierced him. Daniel had spent years convincing himself he was in control of his life, that every move he made was deliberate. But standing next to Grace, he felt powerless. If she was his child, then fate had robbed them both. Of 7 years they could never reclaim. They crossed into a quieter street where neon lights gave way to dim apartment windows. Grace spoke again, almost as if filling the silence. "Sometimes when Mom's too tired, I tell myself bedtime stories. I make them up." Her eyes lit with a brief spark of joy. "In the stories, my dad is brave. He saves people. He brings Mom flowers and fixes broken things. He takes me to the park and pushes me on the swings." She paused, then looked at him with disarming honesty. "Do you think real dads are like that?" Daniel swallowed hard, unable to speak for a moment. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to tell her that fathers were protectors, builders, men who showed up. But his own history with Emily rose up like a shadow. Hadn't he proven the opposite? Hadn't his choices shown that power mattered more than presence? He met her eyes, steady and searching, and admitted, "Some are, some try to be, and sometimes they fail, but that doesn't mean they stop caring." Grace seemed to weigh his words, then tucked her notebook back into her pocket. "I hope mine cares," she murmured almost to herself. "Even if he's not here." Minnie Hook. In that moment, Daniel realized this little girl was carrying hope the way other children carried toys. Fragile, yet impossible to crush, and he was terrified that hope might be tied to him. They passed a bakery, the warm smell of bread drifting out into the night air. Grace pressed her nose against the glass for a moment, staring at the rows of golden loaves. Daniel noticed the longing in her expression, a reminder that she was a child before she was a caretaker. "Are you hungry?" he asked. She shook her head quickly. "I have to save money for Mom's medicine." The practicality in her voice didn't belong to a 7-year-old. Daniel stepped inside without a word, buying a loaf and handing it to her. She hesitated, then accepted it, hugging it to her chest like a treasure. "Thank you," she said, her eyes shining. Then she added something that sent a chill through him. "If my dad was here, I think he'd do the same." Daniel forced a small laugh, but inside his heart was breaking. Every gesture, every word she spoke seemed to draw him deeper into a reality he wasn't ready to confront. Grace wasn't just a child fighting for her mother. She was a mirror reflecting all of Daniel's regrets. As they neared her block, the street grew quieter, the buildings older. Graffiti lined the walls and a flickering street lamp cast long shadows on the pavement. Grace pointed ahead. "That's our place. Mom's upstairs." Her voice carried both pride and shame, as if she knew the peeling paint and broken steps weren't what most people called home, but it was still hers. Daniel looked up at the building, his chest heavy. Every instinct in him screamed to turn back to leave before the truth solidified into something undeniable. But then Grace slipped her small hand into his. The gesture was so simple, so trusting, that it shattered every wall he had built around himself. Minnie Hook. A child's hand, warm and fragile, can undo years of steel and stone. For Daniel Hayes, that touch felt like a question and an answer all at once. Was this truly his daughter? And if so, could he finally be the man she deserved? He didn't know what awaited behind the door at the top of those stairs, but one thing was certain: his life would never be the same again. The stairwell smelled of dust and dampness, the kind of neglect that lingers in buildings no one invests in anymore. Grace led the way, her loaf of bread pressed tightly to her chest. Daniel followed each creak of the steps, pulling him closer to the moment he both longed for and dreaded. When they reached the second floor, she stopped at a chipped blue door. The lock looked fragile, the kind of thing that wouldn't keep anyone out who was determined to get in. Grace fumbled with a key, then pushed the door open with her small shoulder. Inside, the apartment was dim. A thin curtain blocked most of the light, and the air carried the faint scent of disinfectant mixed with sickness. Daniel's eyes adjusted quickly, and then he saw her. Emily Ross was propped up on a thin mattress, her hair darker now, but her face unmistakable. She looked smaller than he remembered, worn down, yet her eyes still burned with the same intensity that had once made him feel invincible. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Grace, who was this Emily's voice was weak, but her tone carried suspicion. Grace stepped forward, placing the bread on the nightstand. "He helped me sell the oranges, Mom. He wanted to make sure I got home safe." Emily's gaze shifted to Daniel sharp, despite her frailty. "You shouldn't be here." Her words cut clean, as if 7 years of silence had only sharpened the blade. Daniel took a step closer, but Emily raised her hand, slightly a warning. "I didn't come to cause trouble," he said, his voice low. "I saw Grace. I saw the photo. I couldn't just walk away." Her laugh came bitter, more a cough than a sound. "Walk away? That's all you've ever been good at." The accusation stung. He wanted to defend himself, to remind her how he had searched, how he had been left with nothing but questions. But seeing her there, weakened, gasping for breath, he couldn't unleash the anger that had lived inside him all these years. Instead, he asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" Emily's eyes flickered pain, mixing with defiance. "Because I knew what your answer would be. The company. The empire. Always more important than us." "That's not true," Daniel insisted, though his voice betrayed doubt even to his own ears. He remembered nights she had begged him to slow down, mornings she woke up alone, because he had already left for meetings. Maybe she was right. Grace watched the exchange, confusion shadowing her young face. She looked from one to the other, sensing the unspoken battle. "Mom, don't fight," she whispered. But her plea was drowned out by Emily's sudden violent cough. She bent forward, clutching her chest, her body trembling with the effort. Daniel was at her side in an instant. "Emily." He reached for her, steadying her shoulders as her breaths came shallow and ragged. Grace cried out fear, cracking her small voice. "Mom, please don't leave me." Panic surged through Daniel. He had closed billion-dollar deals under pressure, negotiated with men who would cut throats for less, but he had never felt this helpless. He lifted Emily carefully, her body far lighter than he remembered, and looked at Grace. "We need to get her to the hospital. Now." Grace nodded frantically, tears streaking her cheeks. Together they hurried down the stairs, Daniel carrying Emily as if she might break apart in his arms. Outside, he waved down a passing cab, his commanding tone leaving no room for refusal. They slid inside, Grace clutching her mother's hand, refusing to let go. Lenox Hill Hospital. Daniel barked to the driver. The cab lurched forward, sirens from a distant ambulance echoing through the streets, as if underscoring their urgency. Emily drifted in and out of consciousness, her head resting against Daniel's chest. He whispered her name, trying to keep her anchored. Grace leaned close, whispering through sobs, "It's okay, Mom. We're going to get help." At the hospital, chaos met them at the doors. Nurses rushed forward with a gurney, and Daniel felt Emily pulled from his arms. "She needs a cardiology team now," one of them shouted. Grace tried to follow, but a nurse held her back. She clung to Daniel instinctively, her small body shaking. He wrapped an arm around her, anchoring them both. Minutes felt like hours in the waiting room. Grace sat beside him, her face pale, her eyes locked on the double doors that had swallowed her mother. Daniel's phone buzzed again, the screen flashing with the words, "London deal urgent." He silenced it without a second thought. For once in his life, business could wait. Grace finally spoke, her voice trembling. "She's all I have." Daniel looked at her, his chest tightening with a truth he couldn't yet speak. If Emily survived, Grace would learn one day that she wasn't alone, that he was tied to her in ways deeper than either of them had imagined. But for now, he simply pulled her closer and said, "She's not alone anymore. Neither are you." Mini-hook. Behind those doors, Emily's life hung by a thread, and with it the fragile hope of a family Daniel never knew he had. The outcome would change everything for him, for Grace, and for the woman he had never stopped loving. The hours at Lenox Hill Hospital stretched into the night, the steady hum of machines blending with the muted footsteps of nurses. Daniel sat rigid in the waiting room chair, Grace curled against him with exhaustion, pulling her eyelids closed. His tailored suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, but he didn't care. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about markets or boardrooms. His entire world was narrowed down to the girl sleeping beside him and the woman fighting for her life behind closed doors. When the doctor finally appeared, Daniel rose to his feet so quickly he startled Grace awake. The cardiologist spoke in a careful, measured tone. Emily had stabilized, but her condition was serious. She would need ongoing treatment monitoring and perhaps surgery if her heart didn't respond to medication. It wasn't good news, but it wasn't the end either. Relief coursed through Daniel like air after drowning. Grace clutched his hand, whispering, "She's going to be okay." He knelt to meet her eyes. "She's going to have a chance, and we're not going to let her fight this alone." The days that followed rearranged Daniel's life. He canceled meetings in London, ignored calls from investors, and handed the reins of his empire to his executives with the simple message, "Handle it. My family needs me." The word slipped out naturally, family, and it shook him. For years, he had built his identity on power and independence. Now, for the first time, dependence felt like strength. He stayed at the hospital every day, reading to Grace in the waiting room, fetching water for Emily, and learning the medical terms he once would have skimmed over. Grace began to lean on him in small but telling ways, asking him to untangle her shoelaces to check her homework, to tell her a story when the nights grew long. Daniel, a man who could command thousands with a signature, found himself humbled by the trust of one small child. One morning, while Emily rested, Grace tugged at his sleeve. "Can you braid my hair?" she asked. He blinked, unsure. "I've never braided anything in my life." Grace giggled softly, handing him a brush and hair ties. "You'll learn." And so he did, clumsy fingers fumbling through strands until something resembling a braid hung over her shoulder. Grace admired his effort in the reflection of a hospital window, smiling proudly. "See? Not bad. Maybe you're good at more than business." That single moment felt like a victory, greater than any deal he had ever closed. Emily watched from her bed, silent but observant. She saw the way Daniel bent to her daughter, the patience he hadn't always had, the gentleness buried beneath his polished exterior. When their eyes met, there was no accusation this time, only a guarded question. Could she trust this version of him? As Emily grew stronger, she was discharged from the hospital. Daniel arranged for them to stay in a modest but comfortable apartment in Manhattan, close enough to her doctor's. He didn't move them into his penthouse. He understood Emily's pride too well. Instead, he gave her space, offering help without suffocating. Grace started at St. Patrick's School, proudly showing Daniel her drawings from art class. One sketch caught him off guard, 3 stick figures holding hands, a sun overhead, and a caption scrawled in uneven letters, "Me, Mom, and Dad." He kept the drawing folded in his wallet, a quiet reminder of the life he was slowly stepping into. Minnie Hook. For years, Daniel's wealth had been measured in numbers and contracts. Now, it was measured in simple moments: homework. Finished meals shared, a child's laughter echoing through hallways. Still unspoken truths hung heavy in the air. Emily remained cautious, unsure if Daniel's devotion would last once the crisis passed. One evening, as the city lights shimmered outside their window, she finally broke the silence. "You've shown up for her, Daniel. For me. But what happens when the next deal calls your name?" Her voice trembled not with anger, but with fear. Daniel didn't look away. "I can't erase the years I wasn't here. I can't undo the nights you faced alone. But I can choose differently now. I don't want to be a man who measures life in profits. I want to be a man Grace can count on. A man you don't have to fear losing again." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but before she could respond, Grace burst into the room, holding a paper flower she had made at school. "Look, Mom. Look, Daniel. It's us." She placed the flower in Emily's hand, her face glowing with pride. The moment was simple, yet it carried the weight of a promise more powerful than words. Weeks later, when Emily was strong enough, Daniel suggested they all take a walk through Prospect Park. The air was crisp, the trees stretching wide as if to shelter them. Grace ran ahead, her laughter ringing like bells. Daniel and Emily followed slowly, their steps tentative but aligned. At a small clearing, Daniel revealed a surprise. In his hands was a sapling, a young orange tree. Grace gasped. "Just like the oranges I sold," she exclaimed. Together, they planted it in the soil, Daniel kneeling beside Emily and Grace as they pressed the dirt around its roots. "This tree will grow strong," Daniel said quietly. "And every time we see it, we'll remember that day wasn't the end. It was the beginning." Emily reached out, covering his hand with hers. Grace placed her small palm on top, sealing the gesture. Minnie Hook. In that moment, titles, wealth, and years of distance dissolved. What remained was a fragile but undeniable truth: they were a family rebuilt from ashes and second chances. As the sun dipped lower, Grace leaned against Daniel, whispering, "I'm glad you're here." His throat tightened and he pressed a kiss to her hair. Emily watched her guarded expression softening, as if for the first time in years she allowed herself to hope. The road ahead was uncertain. Treatments, adjustments, forgiveness not yet fully given. But Daniel no longer feared the unknown. For once, he didn't measure time in deals or deadlines. He measured it in days spent walking Grace to school, evenings reading with Emily, mornings where laughter filled the rooms instead of silence. "Now, I want to ask you, what would you have done if you were Daniel Hayes? Would you have walked away when the past came back, or would you have chosen love over ambition?" Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late to start again. Drop A if you believe family is the greatest fortune of all, because sometimes the most powerful comeback isn't in business. It's in choosing the people you love every single day. Daniel Hayes' story is not just a tale of a billionaire who stumbled upon a little girl selling oranges on a cold New York street. It is the journey of a man who lost everything that truly mattered, only to be given one miraculous chance to reclaim it. From the shocking moment when he saw Grace holding a sign begging for help, to the heartbreaking discovery that her mother Emily, his long-lost love, was fighting for her life, every step tested his heart, his priorities, and the very foundation of the life he had built. For years, Daniel had measured his worth in skyscrapers, in quarterly reports, in the accolades of the world's wealthiest circles. But none of it could fill the void left by Emily's absence. or explain why no amount of power ever silenced the emptiness he carried at night. The twist of fate that reunited him with Grace was both devastating and divine. In her innocent green eyes, he saw not only the reflection of the woman he once loved, but also the undeniable mark of his own bloodline. A daughter he had never known, a life he had missed entirely, and in that moment everything else became meaningless. The path back was not easy. Emily, scarred by years of struggle and abandonment, did not welcome him with open arms. Trust had to be rebuilt, not in grand gestures or empty promises, but in the small, steady choices Daniel made every day. Showing up at the hospital, canceling the meetings that once defined him, holding Grace's hand during the longest nights, and learning the simple sacred language of family homework at the kitchen table, laughter shared over burnt cookies, a bedtime story told by a father who was finally learning to listen. Through sickness and crisis, Daniel discovered what wealth could never buy: belonging. The fortune he once believed was his legacy now paled beside the simple joy of braiding his daughter's hair, of hearing her call his name, of planting an orange tree together in Prospect Park as a symbol of second chances. Emily, cautious but observant, watched as the man who once chose ambition over love now chose them again and again. Slowly, her guarded heart began to believe that redemption was possible. And this is where the deeper lesson lies, not in the drama of riches and loss, but in the power of choosing differently when life hands you another chance. How many of us, like Daniel, chase success at the expense of relationships? How many of us think tomorrow will always be there to say the words left unspoken? Daniel's story reminds us that tomorrow is never promised, but today is always a choice. A choice to show up. A choice to love. A choice to turn back and repair what we once thought was broken beyond repair. For anyone listening today, the challenge is clear. Look at your own life. Who is waiting for your presence, not your presence? Who needs your time, your forgiveness, your undivided attention? Maybe it's a child you've been too busy to sit with at dinner. Maybe it's a spouse carrying a silent burden. Maybe it's even yourself waiting for you to put down the weight of ambition long enough to remember what truly matters. Daniel Hayes didn't change overnight. He stumbled. He doubted. He wrestled with the guilt of lost years. But he kept showing up. And that is the lesson worth carrying. Transformation is not about perfection, but about persistence. About deciding every single day to be present for the people who matter most. Imagine if we all lived this way, valuing relationships over reputation, presence over possessions, love over labels. The world would not only be kinder, it would be stronger. Because families, whether broken or whole, are the foundations on which all else is built. And when we choose to heal those foundations, we create legacies that last far beyond wealth. So, as you reflect on Daniel, Emily, and Grace's journey, ask yourself, what legacy are you building today? Is it one of skyscrapers and empty boardrooms, or one of laughter, healing, and connection? The answer lies not in what you own, but in who you love and how you love them. If this story touched you, let it be more than a story. Let it be a turning point. Call the person you've been meaning to call. Forgive the wound that has festered too long. Show up for the people who count on you. Because one day, like Daniel, you may find that the greatest fortune was standing right in front of you all along. And before you go, if you found value in this story, if it reminded you of what truly matters, please take a moment to support this channel. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Your support is what keeps us going, what fuels us to bring more stories that inspire, challenge, and heal. Together we can build not just a channel, but a community of people who believe that love is always worth the risk, and second chances are worth taking. So go ahead, click subscribe now, and let's keep walking this journey of rediscovering what matters most, one story at a time.